Two conflicting opinions. Did we start, Gimel?
Yes.
Where did we get up to? Third paragraph, right? The opposite applies as well. When a person does an action or speaks words or has thoughts that are not good, then he is damaging. A number of powers or energies and worlds, higher worlds, damaging the kedusha. Le'ein erech v'shir, without any measure. Like it says, that your destroyers and your desolators or whatever, destroyers and those who destroy you will come out of you. In other words, the source of your own destruction, right, is from within you. That's by the way the secret of why the enemies of the Jewish people are always preceded or caused by our own. Right? It's the internal weakness that we have, which is always reflected by the attack that comes from without. Or machshich or maktin eiram kedushasam chas. It is reducing, it darkens or reduces the light and the kedusha. And it is adding power. On the other hand, in the worlds of Tuma, right? It is adding power to the negative side. That is what happens when you are doing things that are bad. They're adding to the negative energy in the world. In other words, he's saying here he's developing the idea that when you do something wrong, or when you do something right, any action, speech or thought, down here is affecting the shorish of that thing. It's going up into the source in the higher worlds, and it is affecting that source and bringing down more kedusha from that source. If you do something that you shouldn't do, or think or speak thoughts or words that should not be done, then you are causing damage. Now he's going to explain later what sort of damage actions do, what sort of damage words do, what sort of action thoughts do. Each of them has got its own particular unique extreme form of damage, and it's got aspects that are less serious than others. Each one has its own uniqueness, and he's going to explain in more detail how the mechanism works. However, let's try to complete what you have reminded me that we said we would try to complete today. Let's first try and relate to that, which is we began to discuss how the actions of a person or thoughts, speech of a person are going up to the sherish and affecting changes. The example that we looked at last time was the idea of how Torah, if you remember, is causative in the world. In other words, just like Torah precedes the world, and it's the model or the program that builds the world, and also the oral law. Do you remember this discussion? Anyone out there?
Yes.
The oral law, right? The opinions of the sages, even an opinion of somebody he represents Torah Shebal Peh, since his opinion is Torah, that's exactly what Torah is. It is the hearts and minds of the sages of the Jewish people. So then such an individual is going to be causative or formative in the world. His attitude will have a formative effect in the world. Now we raised the problem which you promised to deal with. You don't have a seat? The problem that we raised, right, was the question of how there could be two opinions. If we say that in Torah an opinion is causative or formative, then the problem is how can you have machlekes, how can you have two opinions which are mutually exclusive, and then we say that they both have an absolute causative effect? Or put more simply, how can you have two mutually exclusive opinions in Torah and we say they're both right? So let's try to deal with this before we move on in the text. I know some people here have objected to, they don't want to hear shmooze and they want to learn the text. So I'm simply going to complete this issue because we did say we would deal with it, and then we'll try to move ahead in the Sefer. But let's try and complete this fundamental. One simple way out of this, that you can use on certain occasions, I think we referred to last time. We discussed the problem of the man who had a lung problem, and the Chazon Ish told him, right, not to leave Eretz Yisrael. You remember this? In other words, in two different jurisdictions, It could be that two different opinions. In Nardo and Pumpadisa, you could have two opinions of Rav and Shmuel, and each one would be causative and normative for their place. However, what happens when two people argue on the same matter in the same place? How do we say that they're both true? First of all, Rav Wasserman told us that there are occasions when we do not have to say they're both true. There are very, very rare occasions where we say that one is objectively wrong. And there's only one case when that happens. And that is when you have a machlekes, let's say Amoraim, two Amoraim in the Gemara argue, and both are raising an opinion in the name of their Rebbe, and both claim that they heard it from him on the same occasion. In other words, if two Amoraim argue and they say one holds mutter and one holds asu, okay, so we'll try and understand today how they could both be true. But if they both say that they heard this opinion from the Rebbe, right, they're both quoting somebody, and he says he said yes, and he says he said no, even then we usually say that one heard it at one time in his life and another one heard it later, and he changed his mind. Poskim changed their minds, right? For example, the Chavetz Chaim even. Chavetz Chaim writes in the Mishnah Berurah that we make a alamichia we rake Bereim and Amazonas for dessert that's cake, and later in his life he said we don't. And the prevailing practice today is that for dessert of cake or something like that, except for certain rare exceptions, we don't make a bracha. We make a bracha for fruit or for ice cream or something. We don't make a bracha for... He changed his mind. Circumstances changed, custom changed, whatever, right? Sometimes a Tana or Amori would say something in learning, and he would paskin a thing in a case that came before him differently. He would say a certain thing else learning, in other words, he learned up the issue, but when it came a case in front of him, he could rule differently. Rav Wasserman said, in those situations, by the way, we accept la halacha, the one that he ruled in a case, not the one that he said in learning. Why? Because when a case came before him, it squeezed him to a greater extent. Rav Wasserman said it squeezed his brains. In other words, a person has to rule in a given case where there's a practical matter that has to be ruled in real life. It's more pressure, right? Some say there's more siyata d'shmaya also, to approximate the truth because there's a case that demands a ruling as opposed to a theoretical learning up of how the situation would be. So if you ever have to choose between those two opinions, we'll choose the one that's thick. However, what happens if two Amoraim come and they say they heard the Rebbe say something on the same occasion? He didn't change his mind. They walked out of the same shir, and the one said, you see, he said it's okay. And the other one said, what do you mean? He said it's not. In that occasion, right, on that solitary example, we say that one is misquoting the Rebbe. Now, he's not misquoting without reason. He's got incredibly good reason on which to base his particular opinion and why he heard what he heard. And I'm not making a crude and gross mistake. However, only one is saying, in fact, what he said, and one. Even in the case in the Gemara where two Amorim argue, and one of them takes an oath. One of them takes an oath on what the Rebbe said. Takes an oath on what he said. Right? Which means, and is wrong. And the Gemara says that if not for certain conditions, he would have transgressed making a false oath. That's a whole discussion. However, we want to talk about a deeper perspective here. So please stay with me carefully. What happens when two people have an opinion? Two Gedolim, two Tanoim, two Amorim have an opinion, and they are mutually exclusive. How do we say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim? How do we say these and those are both Hashem's words? That they're both right? How do you say that? Especially when the two opinions are mutually exclusive. Now, the case that I'm thinking of, the classic exposition of this, somebody wrote to Rav Hutner and asked him this question. And in fact, the person who wrote to Rav Hutner asked him a question about an argument in the Gemara, not only about mutually exclusive opinions, but where the opinion that is being discussed is factual. Factual. If two people have two different opinions, where opinions are valid, two experts can differ on how a thing should be done, can have two opinions. But when they have two different opinions about a fact, the machlekes that he questioned Rav Hutner about was an argument in the Gemara about the size of the krushim of the Mishkan, the boards that formed the sideboards of the tabernacle of the sanctuary of the Mishkan. There's an argument in the Gemara about what their size was. Now, they were only one size. It's not a matter of opinion. They were only one size. And there's one shitta that says they were like this, and one says they were like that, and we say they're both true. Yeah, what's going on? Are you with me? It's one thing saying, a question of judgment in the grey zone, where you have to make judgments. But you don't make judgments. You're talking about a fact. The Mishkan was a physical structure, and it had a certain dimension. And if one says the dimensions were like this, another one says they were like that, and if that isn't mutually exclusive, I don't know what is. How do we possibly say Elu v'Elu Divrin Kim Chaim? They're both right. What does that mean? That's the question that he was faced with. There's a fundamental thing to understand in learning. There are many examples of this, by the way. I can think of another one. There's a Machlokes Tanoim in Shabbos about what the tzitz look like. You know, the Kohen Gadol wear a tzitz. You know, the headband, right? And on it were the two words Kodesh Lashem. There's a Machlokes there in the Gemara, whether it said Kodesh Lashem like this, Kodesh Lashem horizontally, or Kodesh Lashem, written right one above the other, or slightly separated, but one above the other with Hashem's name on top. Were they written horizontally or vertically, basically? There are two opinions. The tzitz was only one. Aaron HaKohen wore tzitz. You know, it didn't shimmer between two, didn't oscillate between two realities. It wasn't a quantum mechanical tzitz. You know, it was a physical thing, you know. What status did it have? Not only that, but what's even more perplexing is, the Gemara says that Rabbi Eliezer went to Rome and he saw it. You know, in the Vatican they have certain things from the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Eliezer went to Rome and he saw it. And it didn't affect the argument. Now, what's going on? If he went to Rome and he came back, all they should have run up to Rabbi Eliezer and said, which one of us is right? And he should have said, well, I saw it. It's like this. It's completely what he saw and witnessed is completely irrelevant to the discussion. The argument continues even though he saw the fact. What is going on?
Maybe it's only visible to the subjective viewer.
That's a nice mystical answer, but no. So let's understand. The first mistake here, is to understand that they're arguing about the facts. That's called the machlokes in Metzias. They're arguing about the size of the krashim of the Mishkan, right? What was the fact, the historical, archaeological, if you like, fact? The Talmud does not argue about facts. We do not have machlokes in Metzias. There are certain exceptions that appear to be exceptions, etc. But the general principle is there's no machlokes in Metzias. They do not argue about fact. Anytime you come across an argument in the Talmud that appears to be about medical facts or biological facts or certain historical facts, you're making a big mistake. The Gemara does not argue. They do not argue in facts. They're not interested in facts. Listen carefully. The answer to the question is this. When there's a machlekes about a particular thing in the Talmud, right? They're not arguing about what the thing was. They're arguing what's pshat in pasuk about that thing. Stay carefully with me. It's a fantastic principle. That's a fantastic principle. The argument is, what does the Torah say about that thing? Not what was it historically. Again, we're dealing with Torah here. The machlekes is a machlekes in Torah. What does the Torah say about that thing? They're arguing Torah, not history. They're not arguing biology and medicine and archaeology and history. They've got nothing to do with the Talmud. The Gemara is arguing Torah. What does the Torah say about the tzitz? What does the Torah say about the krashim? That's what they're arguing about. When they argued about the size of the krashim, they weren't interested in how they look. That was not the discussion. That's history, that's archaeology. What does the Torah say when it talks about the krashim? What is the size that's derived from the psukim? That's what they were arguing. What does the Torah say about the tzitz? Does the Torah say it's like this or like that? They had an argument. Rabbi Eliezer went to Rome and he saw it. They said, that's not relevant. Who cares what you saw? What you saw means simply that when Betzalel made the tzitz, he decided to make it this way. But the Torah could be read another way too. That's what we're arguing about. Very nice, you saw it. Fine, good, that was his opinion. Fine. Now, leave us alone. We're discussing. There's no machlokes in Metzias. The Torah does not argue, the Talmud does not argue factual, historical, medical, biological facts. It's not Torah. What they are arguing is Torah. What does the Torah say? Now, stay with me carefully. Every pasuk in the Torah can be read in 70 different ways. It says, Kapachi shefoitze etzela, like a hammer smashes a rock and the splinters go off in different directions. Actually, every one of the 70 has 70 others as well. But let's not get into that. At the first basic level, there's 70 different ways that every pasuk can be understood. Which means that the Torah is a multi-potential, do you understand what? It's a multi-potential created document. It's not a fixed, it doesn't work like that. There's a way, a Beis Hillel, for example, will learn every pasuk according to a certain methodology and a certain picture will emerge. Beis Shammai will learn all the pasukim a different way and a whole different Torah will emerge. And it's all in the words. And it's all internally consistent and it all uses the same principles of exegesis. When two sages come to argue, they're not arguing history. They're not interested in history. They're coming to argue what does the Torah say about that fact. Right? Just let's think this through. Stay with me carefully. Why? Because they're learning Torah. The whole inyan of a machlekes in Torah is what does the Torah say about this thing? Rav Hutner goes a little further here. He says that in the Krashim of the Mishkan, the size of the Krashim in the Mishkan, you might think that at least they should be able to solve the halachic argument with reference to history. Because if they could show that the Mishkan was built with dimensions X and not dimensions Y, that's a very powerful argument. If Moshe Rabbeinu himself and Betzalel, if they paskened, if they ruled, if they learned the pasuk a certain way, then surely the one who's arguing with the other one and can refer to the historical fact, he should surely say to him, well, your opinion's nice, but I got Moshe Rabbeinu on my side. Says Rav Hutner, that would be a very powerful argument. It doesn't mean that the other person's invalid, but surely it would sway the discussion if you could show, says Rav Hutner, in that particular argument they were unable to do it. You know why? With the Krashim of the Mishkan. You know why? Because the Mishkan was hidden. We don't have it anymore, right? The Beis HaMikdash and the Kalim, the Beis HaMikdash being the continuous Mishkan, is gone into what's called Geniza. There's been a Geniza, it's being hidden. See, what he's dealing with is the following question. When it comes to an argument that appears to have an application in fact, they're arguing the Torah of the size of the Krashim. However, it has an application in the world. There were Krashim that were built. Why don't you go and look at the size of the Krashim and use that in your argument? It would be very useful. Secondly, we know that they knew the factual aspects of the world. Anything that could be known about the world, they knew. Abai said that he knew the ways of the stars and the planets like the back of his hand. The Gemara's got derivations of the most abstruse and complicated. There's a question in the Gemara. One Roman came up to a Tana and he said to him, how long is a snake pregnant? So he told him how long is a snake is pregnant. So he said, the Roman said to him, like, how do you know how long a snake is pregnant? You got like one of these glass things in your back garden, you study them? He said, no, I looked in the Psukim. The Tana told him, derive the pregnancy duration of a snake from the verses. The verses say that Eve was cursed with pregnancy and the snake was cursed 7 times as much, and he brings a whole calculation and he works out. So the Roman went off and he checked, and that's how long snakes are pregnant. Why? Because he was learning up the Psukim. So you learn from this, but they knew the factual consequences in the world, either from the Psukim or whatever, or from their insight into, they knew what it was. So since they knew the factual aspects of the world, then why didn't they bring the factual knowledge to aid and amplify their halachic argument? Are you with me? Again, if they knew the facts in the world, right, they knew how the body looked. I mean, the Gemara says, for example, that they came to, I think, Rabbi Eliezer, and they said to him, how many parts are there to the body? So he said 248. 248 parts to the body. So they went off and they came back and they said, we dissected a human body. They found a Roman, somebody that the Romans executed. The students. They went and they Pasha dissected a human body. And they counted the organs. And they came back to Rabbi Eliezer and they said to him, there's 252. He said to them, yes, you probably chose a woman. They said, yes. He said, sure, a woman's got 4 more parts to her body. What's the problem? But he knew how many parts there were to the body from the Psukim. He never go into dissections. There's even a Gemara where they went and they did a certain dissection, and they came back and they said, look, you're wrong. He said to me, you bring me proof from the fools, and I bring you proof from the Torah. Where's your head? The pasuk says the body looks a certain way. You go and do a dissection, you think that's proof? Who cares what the world looks like? What's the reality, the world or the Torah? Yeah, you give me a proof from the fools. That's what I said. You go look in the world and you bring me a proof. That's called bringing a proof from the fools. If the Torah says it has to be like this, you made a mistake in the world. That's another problem. The question of Hutner's dealing with is, if they had such an incredible knowledge of the world, why didn't they refer to the historical nature, size of the Krashim and include it in their argument? Says Rav Hutner, because just like we do not merit a revelation of the Mishkan that's gone into Geniza, we do not have the knowledge of the Mishkan either. That's also gone into Geniza. We don't have the knowledge of the Torah of the Mishkan either. If in historical terms, we don't have that structure, so in the mind of Torah, we don't have the knowledge of how that structure was either. And therefore, they couldn't even refer to the historical reality to add to their halachic argument. And therefore, it was a pure halachic argument without any reference to history or archaeology. But that's an exception. That's a particular example of the Krashim. The general principle that you have to remember is, any machlokes in Torah is a machlokes in what the Torah says about that thing. And they're both right. The Pasuk says both of those things. The Pasuk says 70 of those things. They could have a 70-way argument and they'd all be right. The Psukim lend themselves, do you understand? The Psukim lend themselves to many, many different interpretations. And each one's bringing out a particular facet. And he's right. And he's arguing for his interpretation. Now, why does he bring out that one? And why does the other Tana bring out the other one? Because each one functions according to his Sherish Neshama. He's brought to the world with a unique contribution to make, and his uniqueness perceives in the Torah that unique resonance with his Neshama. You understand? Like the Gemara in Pirkei Avos says often, it says, Margalei bepume, it was a jewel in his mouth. That means it was the Torah that he characteristically used to say. This was the thing that you would hear from Rabbi Akiva. This was the thing that you'd hear. It tied in with his... Again, there's a very treif explanation of this. You know that. I don't want to mention any names, but there's certain Jewish sources and colleges and certain Jewish places that learn Torah from a completely heretical perspective. And how do they do this? They say, oh, you know why this Tana has this opinion? Because he came from an agricultural area, and so he saw the whole world through a farmer's eyes. And that's why he's always using those... In other words, he didn't have his own mind. His attitudes were formed, do you understand, by his historical... He lived in the Roman times, and he came from this and this and kind of thing, and he was a shoemaker, and his father was this and that and other. So like, chas v'sholom, that means he didn't have an opinion. He was just formed. Do you understand what... This is all part of that worldview that you're just the response to your environment and you don't have any... Doesn't mean that. But there is a truth. There's a kernel of truth in it. In terms of who he was and his uniqueness, he brings... Why is Beis Shammai always taking the more stringent and more exacting view? Why? Because their characteristic that they bring to the world is that facet of Torah that's called Gvura. Hillel is coming to the world to bring out that facet that's called Chesed. Between the two of them, says the Maharal, the Torah is complete. And before Hillel and Shammai, there was an ability, 3-4 generations before, the whole Torah could be transmitted by one man. For example, Shimon HaTzadik. Right, Shimon HaTzadik, Antigonus, those were people who were big enough to hold the Torah. After they became, the generations dropped, the Torah split into two facets. Beis Shammai brings the Chesed, Beis Hillel brings the Chesed side, Beis Shammai brings the Gevurah side. Between the two of them, the whole Torah is complete again. Until finally it breaks down into more and more and more pieces. But no matter how far it breaks down, each individual sage is bringing out the facet of Torah that's uniquely the jewel, that's a resonance with his personality. And together the whole Torah is complete. He knows that. He knows what it is that he's brought to the world. He knows what his unique insight is. And he's always bringing out that facet or that insight. So whenever you have a machlekes in a pasuk, the one side is bringing out the beauty, that one of the 70 meanings that's the resonance with his unique personality that he's brought to the world to bring out. And the other one's bringing... Now, you know what this means? Just let me add one detail and I'll stop for questions. Do you know what this means? First of all, are we together? You see what I'm saying? You know what it means? If you have a machlekes and one Tana brings out a certain facet, brings out a certain aspect, another one brings out another one, stay with me carefully. Once he's learnt a certain way, once he's brought out a certain meaning and he's learnt a certain way, he's learnt this, he's taken, of all the 70 meanings in this pasuk, he's brought out one. He's committed himself to the rest of the Torah. Because once you've learnt it this way here, you have to learn every other pasuk in the whole Torah consistent. First of all, mechanically consistent. You can't hold that the krashim are this size and then go learn something else that's a size that's inconsistent. The building won't fit together. Once he learns the krashim are a certain size, he's got to learn, but it's much deeper than that. Not only does he have to come out factually consistent, he's got to come out methodologically consistent too. The way that he chose to learn that verse to get that result, he's got to learn all the verses that way. If you interpret a verse in the Torah, if you take a verse and you hold, let's say that the internal logic is more important than the superficial meaning of the words, or whatever it is, right? Like Rashi and Tosfos, very often Rashi takes the more simplistic, superficial, mechanical, rigid meaning of the words, and Tosfos takes slightly more flexible use of the words, more consistent with the internal logic. And that's a theme that runs through Rashi and Tosfos throughout. If a Tana takes a pasuk, and he chooses to learn a verse in a certain way, where you emphasize a word in a certain way, or you take a duplicated word and you extract a certain thing, he's committed himself. Every single example throughout the thousands and thousands of examples throughout the whole Torah, he's got to learn the same way. Do you know what it means? It means that every Tana sees the Torah in a completely different way, and each one is learning that. In other words, have you ever seen those computer programs? They're called cellular automata. Have you ever seen them? A cellular automata in a computer, they take a very small pattern and they give it a very simple set of defined rules. And according to those rules, it continues building the pattern. And the whole pattern that gets built very, very complex is always an expression of the same basic rules. Each Tana in his mind has a slightly different set of rules spiritually. So as he learns the Torah, each one's Torah fans out to be an incredible structure which is all absolutely consistent and completely different from the next ones. And it's got to be consistent throughout. That means if Reb Meir argues with Rabbi Akiva, right, and he learns a certain thing, then in some outlying Masechta that's miles and miles and miles removed, you can hold him accountable for a certain subtle methodological thing that he did here. Are you with me, gentlemen? You know, in the 1920s or 30s, whenever it was, there was a young Bach who faked. He forged a Yerushalmi. You know this? It was a young fellow. You know, in the Yerushalmi, we don't have certain tractates, certain masechtas. Right? We don't know if they never existed or we don't have them. There was a young fellow in a yeshiva then who wrote a tractate of the Yerushalmi. Do you know what that means? Do you know what a genius he must have been? He wrote of his own mind a piece of Talmud Yerushalmi, and he claimed that he found it in an old Geniza. That's a Jewish criminal, by the way. That's a yeshiva type criminal. It is so good that very, very learned, very, very great people acknowledged it as an absolutely remarkable, totally startling find. When the Rogatchover Gaon looked at it, he took one look at it and he said, "This is a fake." So the guy admitted instantly, and he said, "But how did you know?" The Rogatchover said, "Because look, you say over here, Rabbi Meir says this and this and this. Rabbi Meir never could have said that. You have an opinion in the name of Rabbi Meir." The Rogatchover was so in the mind of Rabbi Meir from everything that he'd said all over the place, which is all perfectly consistent. He could never have held this opinion.
That it wasn't consistent with everything else he'd said.
That's right. It wasn't consistent with his methodology and view and insight and angle. Right? It was a slightly different color than all his other statements everywhere, which are all internally consistent. Instantly he said, "This is not German." And therefore each Tana, you understand, had a program that ran differently throughout the thing. By the way, in the days of the Tanoim, every Tana had a different set of Mishnahs. You know that? Before Rebbe coordinated and codified the Mishnah that we have, every Tana had a slightly different set of Mishnahs. You know what Rashi writes? The Gemara says that, you know, in those days a boy used to learn Chumash from age 5 to age 10. From 10 to 15 he used to learn Mishnah by heart with a Rebbe. From age 15 he started learning Gemara. Today we don't do it that way for certain reasons. There it says that from age 10 to age 15, while learning the Mishnah, he has to learn the whole period of all the Mishnah with only one Rebbe. He has to have only one teacher. Why? Because if he would learn half the Mishnah from one Tana, and then he would switch and learn the second half from another Tana, since they had different sets, he might miss a word in the first half that his Tana had in the second half, and then when he learns the second half from the other Tana, he might miss a word there that he had in the first half. And this kid would drop a halacha and he wouldn't know. Therefore, today doesn't apply, because today we want to have one standardized set of Mishnahs, so you can be whoever you learned with. Today there's another reason from learning with one Rebbe only, until you've acquired a way of learning. Once you have a derech in learning and you know how to learn, you've got one style, right, and you know how to do that properly, then you can, once you've acquired a style, then you should become an eclectic and go and build your own style and become a unique individual. But you can't do that while you're being formed. But it's a much more subtle issue. In those days, right, you had to learn all the Mishnah for one Rebbe. Because each one had his own version, he had his own set, but he was big enough to know that it was complete, that had all halachas in the Torah. Yeah, any questions before? Yeah.
With regards to the sets, you said when this Rav went to Rome, he came back, so we're not interested in the actuality.
So it seems.
It's a question. Well, you said Rav Hutner said it's a pity we can't see what the crushing actually looked like, so why the difference? I
presume what it means is that the one of them probably turned to the other one and he said, "You see that Moshe and Betzalel paskin this way, this is how they built the tzitz when they made the kelim," and I presume the other one was impressed by that, but he would continue arguing that the pasuk still allows of this interpretation, and I'm simply bringing out that. He would have turned to him and said, "That's Moshe Rabbeinu's opinion, but mine's different."
So it's not. So yes, it doesn't make a difference how we see the crushing the actual sign, because it's the actuality, it's historical, not.
I presume so. The difficulty is that Rav Hutner doesn't raise this thing about the tzitz. He talks about the crushing, and that's what he says. Look it up yourself. It's in Lamed or Lamed Aleph in the last volume of letters. Someone writes him a letter and he answers with this basic idea. Yeah.
Likewise, just like an American argued with the Tana.
Yeah.
How can an American argue with Moshe Rabbeinu or Betzalel?
I presume that comes into this discussion. I presume that's part of this issue. That means, an American can't argue with the Tana means not that he can't have his own opinion about the fact that this could be a pshat and pasuk. Rav Wasserman told us that an Amora can argue with the Tana, they just withheld themselves from doing so. Yes. Like you'll find Amora very seldom make droshes in psukim. Very seldom do you find an original drosha from an Amora. You find it, but very seldom. They withheld themselves from doing that. They held that they were now at a stage where to make original droshes from a pasuk, that was the work of the Tana. They could, but they withheld themselves. Yeah.
You said in the time of the Shimon Sodi and the Antiphonus, that it could be transmitted by one person.
Yes.
Later it'd be
that's right.
split.
The Maral says that.
So It seems strange that when it should split in two with Hillel and Shammai,
Yeah.
that we should pick one. Why don't
We don't pick one. They're both valid. No, let's get this clear. When Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai come along and they argue two different points of view, right? They're both Torah. We can't rule according to two opposite opinions in practical halacha. Listen. They're both Torah, they're both 100% valid. Right? They're both 100% valid. When the later generations have to choose which one we will live by, we have to make a decision. Now, why do we choose to rule according to Beis Hillel for our generation is a question. You want to know the answer? It's basically because we cannot live up to the standard of Beis Shammai. There are opinions who say that when the Mashiach comes, we will leave Beis Hillel and we'll live according to Beis Shammai. It's a higher opinion, but it's too stringent.
Isn't it just like symbolic of like the two different middle, which they...
it's not symbolic.
It's not like, when the Mashiach comes, we don't need to go by Beis Hillel.
I don't follow you. You want the Gemara says the reason we paskin like Beis Hillel is because they were humbler and they put the words of Beis Shammai first. Since they put their words first and they were so humble, we rule according to them. That's what it says. Right? Many people explain that for our generations we need the leniency dimension of Beis Hillel. But if we were capable, we could live on the stringency of Beis Shammai. And there's a depth to that as well. Are you with me? It's not chas v'shalom who's right and who's wrong. They're both completely valid. It's by Hillel and Shammai that the Gemara says, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chaim. It's dafka by them that it says, these are both words of Hashem. Why? Because the psukim in the Torah contain both of those dimensions.
Can this be compared by Chassidus and Chassidim and Mitnagdim as to a Chassid must be a Chassid in everything he does, and Yeshiva Shagai must be a Mitnagdim in everything that he does, and they're both right.
Sure. Definitely. They both have potential to be taken beyond, as has happened.
Right.
But the time has proved that they both have the kedusha of being part of Klal Yisrael, of course. Sfaradim and Ashkenazim in certain ways have got different... Sure, they all make... The 12 tribes are all different, but they all harmonize to make one whole. Yeah.
So the way you just put it, answering, that guy's question was that there's two different dimensions, right, according to two different opinions.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, I can understand that with certain laws, but when you've got a physical building, you've got a physical thing.
They're not arguing about the physical building. That's the point. They were not arguing about
They
were not arguing about that. They were arguing what does the pasuk say should be the measurements.
Right, but you would at the end get two separate buildings.
That's right. And if one of them were allowed to build the Mishkan, it would look one way, and if the other one were the one in charge, it would look another way. Do you know that it says that Moshe and Betzalel had a big argument about how to build the Mishkan and the Kalim? There was a big argument, and it was built according to Betzalel's opinion. For example, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to build the Kalim first and then the Mishkan later, and Betzalel wanted to build the Mishkan first and then the Kalim, and that's how it was taking place. He overruled. There were two different ways to do it, and that reflects Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Yes.
What about the tabernacle? Sorry.
What about it?
The tabernacle. Hashem helped Moshe build it.
He erected it. Yeah.
Right. So does anyone question how that was built?
That was miraculous how he actually put it up in the end. But the pieces had been made by the Jewish people. Yeah.
Is there an implication then that, with regard to your example of the snake and the pregnancy, is there an implication that another rabbi from another school, having been asked the same question, could give a different answer, and it would also have been true in the physical world?
Why do we have to say that? Since snakes have one type of pregnancy, they all would have been able to derive that same fact from Psukim. Why would you...
Well, say for example he didn't...
There's a more subtle...
Say the rabbi had never investigated the pregnancy of snakes. It wasn't something he'd studied.
Yes.
The question
but you're making a mistake. If there's one reality in the world, and what he's trying to give the Roman is an answer for the reality, how many parts the human body has, how long a snake is pregnant, then the Psukim are going to give him the right answer. When he's learning Torah, and the reality is not the point, which is not dealing with snakes' pregnancies or parts of the human body, he's dealing with what the holy pshat in Pasuk is about a Mishkan, then the Psukim will have 70 different applications.
Each Tana has his own derech of learning, and he needs, and from that derech, he has to derive the whole Torah. How can we have a compilation of different Tanas?
When do we have a compilation of different
Tanas? The
Tanas?
Mishnah.
It's not. It's all Rebbe's. That's exactly the point.
That's his derech of learning.
Yes. Rebbe was great enough to fix for all time till the Mashiach comes the particular version that we need that takes us through the Golos. And the rest he left out in the Brises and other things. He codified and edited the set that we need. Yes, sure. We all use now Rebbe's set. Yeah. The Mishnah is just an example. It's not a derech in learning, whether you choose this set or that set. I'm just giving you an example. We're not that's not like a ton of learning how to learn a pasuk a certain way. That's already a question of his own. Do you understand? It's much more deeply a question of his own inner expression.
You know, the Gemara, it talks about how much better it is. I can't remember many years ago, but two people are, halacha, the road is one way, and the other guy says, if the halacha is like me, like a little turn back, and then the bas kol comes down, and says the halacha is like him, and in the end we still didn't pass him like the bas kol.
Right. What about that? That's because the Torah is not in Shemayim. So the Torah has given us instructions that we are the possessors of Torah, and therefore they ruled according to the majority, which is the Torah said. Even though a voice came out like Rabbi Eliezer, they ruled like Rabbi Yeshua because the majority was on his side. If a prophet would walk in and tell us what the halacha would be, the Rambam says he's killed as a false prophet, because the halacha has got nothing to do with prophecy. The halacha is the way the rules of Torah apply in the world to the consciousness of the sage. By the way, this is one of the reasons that women don't learn Gemara. Because when a man learns Gemara, he has to get to the end result of the conclusion together with his own consciousness. Do you understand? There's part of his own opinion that's put in. The remarkable thing, the grasp that he has to have at the end of the day when he's fathomed the sugya deeply enough is a personal grasp that is totally objective, and yet it includes his own opinion and consciousness. And that's not a woman's function, that's not her role. She has a different way of accepting things. A remarkable thing, the oral law by its nature is involving the one who transmits it. Incredible idea, but it's our share in Torah. We're not just trying to learn it objectively like a library. We don't want to become like a tape recorder and a total repository of information. No, we want to learn Torah together with the formation of the vessel that learns it, and there's a harmony between the opinion that goes in and the person who holds that opinion. Incredible. And that's why two Tanaim can come out two different opinions and both be right. Because each one's, you understand, a reflection of what he uniquely is in Torah. Because Torah is the Jewish people.
And yet we say that with Moshe Rabbeinu he was greater than the other Nevi'im because he was
objective,
more translucent, more objective.
And despite that, it says he was from Beis Shammai. Do you know that? Despite that, it says he was from the side of Beis Shammai. And Betzalel was from Beis Hillel, and that's why they argued. Some use that to illustrate that Beis Shammai is the higher dimension. It's the side of Din. And Moshe Rabbeinu was up there. He couldn't relate to things. He couldn't relate to Rabbi Akiva's Torah. He couldn't even understand what it meant. He was mamash holding on that level. Do you understand what's going on? Do you know what the Arizal says? I mean, this is mind-boggling. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Shemayim to get the Torah, right? So he found Hashem tying crowns to the letters, right? He found Hashem putting the ksarim on the oisios. So Hashem said to him, so Moshe Rabbeinu said to Hashem, he asked him, so Hashem said to him, Klum yesh shalom b'mkochik. You don't greet people where you come from. You don't say shalom. So Moshe said, I thought that the Rebbe should greet the Talmud first. I didn't. Moshe is having a machlekes with Hashem. Huh? He stands there in total silence. Hashem says to him, why don't you say shalom? Klum yesh shalom b'mkochik. People don't greet people where you come from. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, the way I learned was that the Rebbe first greets the Talmud. It's a chutzpah for the Talmud to greet the Rebbe. So Hashem said, Haya lecha lo ozreini. You should have helped me. Haya lecha lo ozreini. You should have helped me. You should have helped me. In other words, you should have opened. You hear the machlekes? Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, listen carefully. Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, I thought that the Rebbe speaks first. It comes down from the top. You know whose opinion that is? Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai say 8 candles and we go down to 1. And Hashem was saying, Haya lecha lo ozreini. You know what the Arizal says? Haya lecha lo ozreini is the letters of Hillel. Haya lecha lo ozreini. Oisios Hillel. You hear what the argument was up there? Moshe Rabbeinu was expressing the side of Beis Shammai because he was from the side of Beis Shammai, and Hashem was expressing the side of Beis Hillel. Do you know what's going on? And that's how the Torah was given. Anyway, I don't want to go into it now. I have a tape in the library that's called Rebbe. I think the tape is called Hillel and Shammai, right and left hands. Get that tape if you're interested in the subject. There are 2 versions. One is called Hillel and Shammai, left and right hands, advanced, which is more for people who've got a yeshiva background, a Torah background. I once gave a share on that project.
If we had 2 various opinions, that's right. So why can't we today decide which opinion?
We do. How do we rule today? We do. The great sages of each generation rule which is the one that's appropriate for us. If what you mean is why don't you decide, and him and him and him, sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. You have to know what the rules of Torah say. Sometimes there's a majority in your generation that fixes it. After we come along and decide that from now till Mashiach we rule like Beis Hillel, you're no longer free. You know why? Because somebody much greater than you in a majority, according to Torah opinion, has ruled that from now on, we hold like Beis Hillel. Sometimes in halacha there's room to take the minority view. Sometimes in extreme circumstances, the minority does come up. You have to know, there's rules, yes.
To go on what I was saying about Dr. Shmaimi, but I understand that we keep halacha because we believe it to be the will of God, that we do this thing. We don't.
But the will of God is that your opinion gets involved in His opinion. And sometimes His will is that you can outvote Him. But it's not directly today's subject, if you don't mind.
Right.
What?
The verse comes down and says, which is from Shemaim, says, the will of God is that you do the halacha like this.
But the will of God has already been expressed as being that which the majority rules. And therefore, prophetic... There's a good question. And it would seem to be to indicate and to vindicate Rabbi Eliezer, first of all, and to show that objectively there's no harm in showing that from an absolute perspective that's his opinion. But he's also previously told us that what I want more than my objective opinion is your subjective opinion, which is valid Torah. That's what I want. Do you know the Gemara says that afterwards they saw Hashem, Eliyahu came down and they asked him, and he said Hashem was smiling at that time and saying, my children have defeated me. Okay, that's not our subject directly. Okay, now before people start trying things, let's learn a bit of text. Vayivra zeu, but it's a fundamental point. And look it up in Rav Hutner. Vayivra Elokim is Adam b'tzalmai b'tzelem Elokim. This is what it means that Hashem created man in His image, in the image of Hashem, of Elokim. Ki b'tzelem Elokim also. He's emphasizing the name Elokim. Shekamosh yuz bar shmoi hu Elokim. Just as Hashem is Elokim, which means Bala Koiches Animtzayim B'Kol Ha'olomas Kulam, the definition of the name, the pshat in the word Elokim, is the possessor, the power behind all the energies in the creation and above all the worlds. That's the name, the meaning of the name Elokim, right? Not the name Hashem. The name Elokim means the one who is the power behind all the energies in creation. Just like He organizes and conducts all of the energies that are taking place throughout all the worlds, at every moment the way He wants them. Kain hishlit ritzono yizbach ez ha'adam she'ei hu ha'posech v'soiger shel kama alfa riboz kochel zolomas. Similarly, He put the human being in a position where he is the one who opens and closes all the hundreds of thousands of energies and forces and worlds. Al pi kol prate sidra na'goisa, by means of all the details of all the systems of his actions, b'kol inyonov, in all his matters, b'kol eis v'rega mamash, every instant and every moment, literally. Kefi shosha elyon shel ma'asav v'dibro mashal. According to the superior source, the root, if you like, of all his actions, words, and thoughts. Ke'ilu hu gam ken abal koch shalem kivyochel, as if he too was the possessor or the master of all these energies. What he's saying is, beautiful, beautiful pshat. Why does it say Tzelem Elokim? Why doesn't it say Tzelem Hashem? Why doesn't it say the image of Hashem and His name of essence? Why does it say the image of Hashem and His name of Elokim? Again, do you understand? What he's faced with here is, why does it say the Tzelem Elokim? Why does it not say Tzelem, some other name of Hashem? And he explains as follows. The Elokim name means Hashem's conduct of the world. So B'Tselem Elokim means that you made in the image of the one who controls the worlds, which means that all your actions and all your thoughts and all your speech is controlling the worlds. That's what it means. That's what's being indicated. It doesn't mean you look like him in his point of origin, right? Not relating to that now. We're relating to the fact that as Hashem masters and controls and organizes all the energies and conduct of the world, you created in the image of that controlling energy. So the Tzelem Elokim means that the human being, among many other meanings, is connected up to all the control switches and control lines, right, in all the higher worlds and the lower worlds. And by every action that you do down here, you are going up to the source of that thing, and you're making a change to the whole system, right? In a sense, just like the Shem Elokim is that which controls and organizes and conducts everything that happens, so too everything that you do is controlling everything that happens in the world. Va'amru zal, va'echa Rabasi, and that's why they have said in the Medrash, va'yelchu b'loi chayach, that they walked without any power. Rabbi Akiva b'shem, this is not Rabbi Akiva, it's a mistake. It's a mistake. If you look it up, it is Rabbi Azariah, I think it is over there. B'shem Rabbi Yeshua ben Sisma over there. Omer, The time when the Jewish people are doing what Hashem wants, they add to the strength of Hashem's kivyochel, Hashem's power. In other words, we give Him power. Like it says, Belokim nas echayel. In the Shem Elokim has been added or made energy, power. Right? These are very dangerous ideas. You have to be very careful how you say these things. It says that we, kivyochel, are influencing Hashem. We're giving Him power that He didn't have before. Right? And at times when the Jewish people are not doing what Hashem wants, we weaken the power of that which is above. We weaken Hashem. Like it says, you have weakened the rock of your foundation. In other words, the rock that gave you birth. Tzur is always a reference to, Tzur literally means a rock, but its deeper meaning is Tsayar. Tsayar means the former, the one who forms or creates, right? Tzur means a rock, literally, but it's the same root in Hebrew as Latzur in Hebrew means to form. What? Tsayar is an artist or one who shapes or forms things, right? Tzur Yelodcha, the point of origin that has given birth to you, you have weakened. You have to be very, very careful the way you say these things, right? If you walk out into the street and tell people that we strengthen God or we weaken God, right, they'll either think you're raving or they'll think you've converted. Right? You don't have to be very careful. It doesn't mean that. It means, deeply understood, it means that the way He conducts the world, right? The Shem Elokim that conducts the world, we give that more power. Right? By our actions, we enable Him to conduct it more according to the way it at all. And the style of the Nefesh HaChaim is, as you should have realized by now, he says an idea, he brings sources for it, and then he brings the sources usually in the Zohar, right? He brings the Zohar, which talks literally about these things. He brings a quotation from the Zohar that illustrates his point. Right? It's about the last place these days in the yeshiva world that you can actually quote Kabbalah and not be thrown out. Right? If you quote it from Nefesh HaChaim, they're still acceptable. The Zohar says, the Choyvei Barnash, that the sins of human beings, Avdin Pegimul Eila, are causing a defect in the higher worlds. V'chein lehefech kanal. And similarly, the reverse, as we have said before. V'zeh she'amar HaKosav, and this is what the verse means when it says, Tnu oiz lelokim, give power to Elokim, right? Again, it does not mean, chas v'shalom, to Him Himself. It means to His ability or His channel of energy that comes into the world. That's what it means. Again, make no mistake. Shem Elokim means Hashem coming into and operating and energizing and conducting the world. That you can improve and that you can damage. Is this clear, gentlemen? Nobody's saying that you weaken Chas v'Shalom Hashem or you strengthen Hashem. Chas v'Shalom. We're not talking about that. We're talking about His name of bringing His conduct into the world. That you can strengthen so that He comes in more and the world has more light. Or you can darken it and keep Him out. You're not Chas v'Shalom affecting Him, as he's going to explain in very, very great detail later. But you are affecting His interaction with the world, because that's in our power.
You mentioned before that if a person wants to do a good deed, is this the same force that He affects that somebody else might think, I'll put a pill on today? Is that the same force that we're talking about?
Yes, because when you do something right, you bring more glow into the world, and other people could pick that up too, and it could give them an advantage, yes. And especially the Jewish people. When you do something right, you help all of us. And when you do something wrong, I have a claim against you because you brought me down. You brought me down. That's because we're one organic entity. When the Jewish people sinned at the golden calf, Hashem said to Moshe, Lech reid ki shichei samcha, you go down. Because your people have sinned. You go down? What did he have to do with it? He's the head of the body. When the body goes down, the head goes down. Yeah? If you step your feet from one step to a lower step, all of you goes down. Your head didn't take the step. You're one organic entity. The Jewish people is like that. When the lowest go down, the highest go down. When the highest go down, the lowest go down. When the highest goes up, they schlep everybody up. If a Jew is sinning today in Paris, you're in trouble. And in fact, you have a claim against him because he's weakening the whole situation and he's putting you in danger. He's putting you in danger today. If your one hand bleeds, your whole body's in trouble. If your one hand bleeds badly enough, it happens in London too. Don't look at him. If your one hand bleeds badly enough, the rest of you is bleeding too. You can't say, well, it's only that hand. It's connected, right? You may not know your connection with me, but as the Jewish people, and in a more large sense, the whole universe, but especially the Jewish people, we're one organic entity. When one piece bleeds, the whole thing's bleeding.
I don't understand. In terms of Elohim is what Hashem comes into the world.
Yeah.
And that depends on our mitzvahs or averos.
Yeah.
But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is infinite.
Yeah.
Then surely even if we're all doing massive averos, he can still come into the world more than...
He could, but he sets up the system in such a way that he makes us the tzelem. And on our backs rides his interaction with the world. That's how he set the system up. Later he's going to go into details of the anatomy of how it looks and why it is this way and all its connections. But the principle is that he set the world up in such a way that he put us in charge of the way it runs, and he brings himself into it more riding on our backs, or he keeps himself out of it when we don't allow him in. That is our control over the world. We're not just puppets over here.
Rabbi, isn't there a notion that by your actions and your words and by your thoughts you create malarim?
Yeah.
Malarim of Tumah and malarim of Torah.
Right.
And this malarim creates a filter.
Right. 100%.
What can we give more power to this power that Hashem brings in the world? To physically go and do a chesed, or to sit and learn Torah?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Excellent question. He's going to go into this more, but I'll just say this. When you do a mitzvah that's physical, you bring energies down into the world that aid that department. When you learn Torah, you bring energy into the world that aids that department. Which one is higher objectively? Learning Torah is the greatest. Which one objectively is more? If you could choose to go and do certain mitzvahs, or you could choose to learn Torah, learning Torah is the lifeline, right, that brings everything in that's far more important than anything else. Now, that depends. That's the general concept. But depends. Sometimes you have to close the books and go do a mitzvah. Some individuals are more suited for doing chesed in the world and manifesting their personalities that way. That's what they should be doing. Other people are more gifted in being able to learn purely. There's a lot of individual variation here of where each person... The answer to your question from the depth is, who are you? Are you part of the brain cells? Are you part of the fingers? Are you part of the feet? What are you? Yeah, each part of the body has to be doing what it has to be doing. If the fingers are trying to do what the feet are doing, you're in trouble. If the brain cells are trying... The beauty of the Jewish people is that you have to find out where you fit. If your part is more in mitzvahs, right, or more in earning a living and using it correctly, etc., then that's what you have to be doing, and you'd be failing if you did something else. But if someone else's part is in the base medrash and he's be'ikah, able to learn Torah primarily, and he's out there doing something else, then, right? Where there's a freedom of choice, freedom, latitude, a person should rather choose Torah. But where he knows, Al-Pi Das Torah, that he should be doing this or that or the other thing, then he should be doing that thing. You know about so the fellow was sitting in yeshiva, and he was learning, and he happened to look out the window and he saw someone drowning. Now, you know, it says that Talmud Torah is keneged kulam, bigger than saving lives. Torah is greater than saving lives. It doesn't mean that if someone's life needs to be saved, then you learning, you ignore him. If someone's life needs to be saved, then it has to be done now and only you can do it, you close the book. But it means in an absolute sense, if you could have had a choice whether to be the one to save that life or let someone else do it and be learning Torah, Torah is better. Anyway, saw this fellow drowning, so he ran down the stairs, flew out, dived into the lake and saved his life. When he got back, his Rosh Hashiva said to him, "Shakach, but why were you looking out the window?" Okay, we'll stop here. Goes away with the joke.